while she was there, she slowly taught herself to use the internet, removing her own indoctrination that was put over her by like kind of doing her own research bit by bit. So now I have this elderly woman that's in California that I don't have any legal rights to that wants to leave. How do you do that with a person that requires oxygen? The hospice facility that they put her in was significantly better than the way that she was living when she was at the Big Blue building in Hollywood. They wanted her off campus because they were scared that if she died on their installation, they would have to call medical services. Medical services would see how their staff are living. They had, like, all these adults were in a room jammed in there with a bunch of bunk beds. Seniors that were sleeping on bunk beds in this room that had no heating or ventilation. People would work there until they died. She also started slowly sharing with me some of the financial crimes that had been perpetrated on her, which we really didn't find out fully about until we were able to help her escape. I wish that the elder abuse that my mother endured for over a decade while they took everything from her and worked her to death was only unique to her. There are all sorts of people in the exact same situation that do not have the ability to either get out of that because they still are believing in this cult and its belief system, what it is promising to them, even though they are empty promises.
Hey, my name is Shelise Ansola, and this is Cults to Consciousness, where we discuss leaving high-demand religions or organizations and finding healing and independence through awareness and true individual sovereignty. If you're only listening and you want to see our faces, go to our YouTube channel at Cults to Consciousness. It's always so nice to see you guys in the comments, leaving those positive words of encouragement for our guests who are bravely coming on and sharing their stories with us. This channel wouldn't exist without them. Also, like, subscribe, all the YouTube-y things to help us boost the algorithm and expose more of these culty groups to the world. So today's guest, he was a referral from Claire Headley. She was also in Scientology. Awesome person. We've done extensive videos on her story. And she said, you got to talk to Mike Brown. He has quite the story, and he's also gotten his mom out of Scientology after he found out all of the elder abuse going on. So he grew up in Scientology. He was a cadet, worked at the international base. We'll go through his entire story as well as how he was able to discover that his mother was being abused by Scientology financially in many other ways and how he was able to get her out. So thank you so much for joining us, Mike Brown.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate being here.
Yeah, of course. And you're a pro at this. You've told your story a few times. But as always, I like to dig a little deeper into some of the details.
Sure. I know I'm very happy to share this. You know, kind of starting doing this, really I've started sharing my individual story and my mother's story and kind of the story of my family and how we ended up in Scientology and then how we ended up out of Scientology just within the last probably 6 to 8 months. Prior to that, I wasn't contributing, even though I've been out of Scientology for 20 years, and I've been on their bad person list, being called a suppressive person for the majority of that time. I didn't want to create problems for my family, specifically my mother, while she was still in it. So I was just kind of doing my own thing and kind of not speaking out. But I'll share with you kind of the progression of that and what occurred with our story and why we think it's so important to actually speak out at this time, even though a lot of time has passed for my story, but my mother's story is a little bit fresher and something that she has had to endure. The story is fresh. It's something she's had to endure and live through just within the last couple of years.
Yeah.
So this is us kind of speaking the truth to power and speaking out against a cult and a group that had very much controlled our lives for the better part of the last 35 years.
Right.
So it's quite a lot, but there's a lot here. So.
And you have your own YouTube channel at Mike Brown 101, right?
I do. Yeah. I've started working that recently.
Yeah, and he's been putting out videos, guys, with his mother, videos of his mother. So this is all done with her consent as far as sharing her story on her behalf. So I just wanted to put that out there. And if you want to see from her directly, you can go to Mike's YouTube channel. We'll link it in the description. So when it comes to your story, let's just start with how your family got involved in Scientology and how that changed your childhood.
My childhood, I guess you could see it as both kind of a typical middle-class suburban childhood, but at the same time, there were a certain amount of problems that existed kind of behind the scenes. My father was a Vietnam veteran. He had gotten wounded in Vietnam. He was a Marine officer and he got badly wounded. He was an amputee and got medically retired. He dealt with a lot of post-traumatic stress, and the family dynamic was very much centered around my father's stress or inability to cope with that. So when my father would have good days, the family would have good days. And when he had bad days, it devolved quickly into a lot of verbal and sometimes physical abuse. So that was more or less the dynamic of what my childhood was like. And my mother came from a very large Catholic family, so she was used to kind of a spiritual upbringing. But then when she got involved with my father, she drifted very much away from a connection with her family. And the family environment had a lot of probably dynamics that you would find in a cult environment as well, which maybe made us predisposed to find ourselves in Scientology eventually, just due to some of those family interactions. When I was 7 years old, my father got a copy of Dianetics. There was a big, marketing campaign to kind of re-energize it back in the 80s. And he read Dianetics. He liked what he saw, and he then wanted to get the family involved in Dianetics. He wanted to see if it could help him, but also if it could also help my mother and make her a better communicator. And so my family got involved in it at kind of the entry-level organizations. They have these small organizations called missions, and then kind of their entry-level delivery organizations referred to as class 5 organizations that help people go up to and attain what they refer to as the state of clear. So this was in Denver, Colorado. My parents were public Scientologists doing services, and it started out as a couple interactions that would happen over the weekend where they would go down and receive services. And anyone who gets involved with Scientology, you'll quickly find that it slowly monopolizes all of your additional time that you have in your life as a public paying Scientologist. And my family started spending all of their time and all of their money and all of their resources down at this organization getting these services. And they even had me start to receive some of those services as a child. Now that I am a parent and I have children that are about the same age that I was when my parents got involved in Scientology, looking back at that, able to kind of qualify and quantify the level of indoctrination that occurs with a normal membership, let alone children, puts a lot of things in perspective for me that I think I took for granted for a large portion of my life. Because when we kind of reflect back to our childhoods, maybe we don't see ourselves as children. We usually kind of reference things through the lens of the way we see things now. And now that I have kids, it's a little bit more of a stark reality that I think is important to talk about.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. So what would those sessions look like for you? How old were you? Were you scared? Did you enjoy it? What's going on there?
So there's two main types of services that are delivered in Scientology. There are the counseling services that are referred to as auditing. And those are very much like talk therapy that you would find in psychotherapy or psychology, but just kind of a 1950s version that Hubbard had adapted his own technology towards. And then there is the training side, which teaches you how to become that kind of therapist or to receive like self-help kind of personal coaching kind of approach to things that they have at the introductory levels. So the auditing aspect to that, when I received some of that, you're sitting one-on-one, probably not too dissimilar with us, the way we're sitting here just talking to each other in a quiet room and with no outside distractions, and you're being asked a list of questions that are trying to get you to respond to specific things. And they try to address a point of trauma and then try to get you to tell everything about that, the time, place, form, and event of it. And then if you don't feel better and you're being monitored on this thing called an electropsychometer or an e-meter, that's this thing with a gauge on it that then you're holding these cans, and they have this little current that's going through your body and it reacts to apparently your thoughts. It's very similar to a galvanometer that's been used in psychology for probably close to 100 years. So as I was a child being asked these questions, they're kind of going in terms of what are you experiencing in terms of trauma or fears. They'll then ask you for earlier times once you've told that one specific incident, earlier times until you get these exact manifestations on this meter. And for a kid that's not able to kind of quantify your life experience yet and understand what's around you and having an adult in front of you asking those questions, it feels very overwhelming.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily always aggressive. A lot of their therapy is focused on help, but usually it is aimed at adults that are coming in with a ruin that they're trying to address. When the parents have children do that and the children aren't really able to consent, it gets very strange very quickly. And I just remember parts of it make you feel kind of euphoric, and you're getting all this attention from somebody directly listening to you, which as a child you don't always receive. It kind of just left me feeling generally confused. That, along with the training that I was doing, made it to almost like boundaries that should exist were starting to be broken down. And they have these type of training that are called training routines, where you've probably heard people talk about TRs in Scientology. Well, as a child, the first levels of this is you're just sitting across from another person staring at them, and it gets you kind of comfortable with being in another person's space and not reacting. A lot of the things is kind of measuring your reaction or getting you to not react to certain things. And once you're able to just sit there, then they make you go on to the next level, which they call bull baiting, which gets you to then sit there and sit through and not react to people verbally and lightly touching you, trying to create reactions with you. So when this is being done on a child, you're indoctrinating that child. They refer to it as keeping in your TRs or your training routines, where you don't react to certain situations and you just sit there almost, stoically, no matter what is said to you. And typically these things devolve into a lot of sexual communication and aggressive verbal posturing that normally people should not endure. When you do that at a very basic level, it gets people used to tolerating an existence which is demanding that type of interaction, which is not normal.
No, that's extremely dangerous, especially for a child, because you're teaching them that it's okay for people to talk to you like that, or address you in a certain way, or say sexual things, or maybe even do sexual advances, and they're taught to not respond. That's incredibly dangerous. You're taking away all of their normal reactions that any person would have, like the fight, flight. They're teaching freeze, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not teaching you how to get away from dangerous situations. They're teaching you how to accept it. That's incredibly dangerous.
Right. And another thing that became kind of confusing for me is some of the basic beliefs in Scientology. The Dianetic stuff was not a spiritual in nature. It was more or less focused on, dealing with your mental problems that you might be experiencing. And we could go into too long of a discussion about Dianetics, but eventually in the mid 50s, the idea of Scientology kind of came about, which Dianetics was the precursor to that, where they started to address these times of pain and unconsciousness, which they refer to as engrams, but starting to look at them from a spiritual perspective. They had this device that I had talked about, that electropsychometer, the e-meter, and this thing registers kind of thought responses. When a person reacts to something, it changes your physiology to a certain degree, where it then shows up on this meter. So they do this process of, when you're in these counseling sessions, of always asking for an earlier time something happened. And in Dianetics, they thought the earliest thoughts and experiences that could be traumatic for an individual occurred basically at birth, or maybe prenatal in the mother's womb. If something would be traumatic, that might be recorded by the child. And then they thought that would be the earliest event. Well, when they introduced this e-meter, they kept getting thought reactions, which are really emotional reactions. And they started continuing to ask these earlier questions. And when you're out of earlier this lifetime questions, what ended up happening is, as people kind of would be receiving this counseling, and the counselor, the auditor on the other side, keeps asking for an earlier time, they start coming up with responses to that. And that kind of opened the door to the belief in past lives, and people kind of coming up with answers to these questions based off of the reactions on this meter. And then Scientology very much deals with past lives, the whole thought that you have lived millions of times before this, and that we just keep kind of being reborn on this planet. With that, a big belief in Scientology is that if you follow along these processes that Hubbard had created, you're going to regain previous powers that had existed millions and millions of years ago for you, that you have lost through these times of pain and unconsciousness, or that we have, basically been kind of reduced down to the current state of man. So really what you run into is, we've all lived before, we've lived numerous times before. And with that, we have all of the experience of our previous lives kind of in our memories from these past lives. So the whole idea of, a normal family unit where you have children being raised by their parents that then, grow up to be contributing members of society, they very much believe that children are just adults in small bodies that have lived previously. Now, as empowering as that sounds for a kid, that opens up the door to a lot of abuse. Because if previously, let's just, play a thought experiment. If I was one of your previous ancestors, I have like all of this knowledge from my previous lives that I should be able to recapture through Scientology. So why would you be treating me like a child if I used to be a grandfather or a father? Anyway, it opens up the door to not really valuing the child development needed in early childhood education if we have all experienced everything previously.
How are you experiencing this as a child? When did your parents switch into Scientology? At what age were you introduced to this?
When I was 7 years old. So when we got into it, my father reading the book Dianetics, at this point, they use Dianetics very much as a vehicle to get people to come into Scientology organizations. It's not like you come in, you do Dianetics, and then you kind of switch over to Scientology. At this point, when you show up, you're receiving Scientology. So there are the Dianetics processes, which are kind of would be kind of the precursor to the things that have been more or less changed to the way that they're doing it now. But it's just a recruitment tool when they push Dianetics to get people in to start doing that Scientology. So for me, it happened at the age of 7. And when you tell a 7-year-old, like, hey, you have these innate godlike capabilities that you could regain. I mean, I was a kid that loved to, watch action movies and Transformers and G.I. Joe. And if you're going to tell me that I have all these amazing abilities, that's kind of a very heady feeling like, hey, I'm somehow special. And it's okay if you tell your children they're special, but I also believed in Santa Claus. So there's a lot of room there for magical thinking with children, and they're very easily influenced. And when you really believe some of these things, now the difference in Santa Claus, at a certain point, your parents are going to tell you, hey, guess what? We've been the ones putting the presents under the tree. But in Scientology, no one's actually going to come out and say, hey, we were full of shit about all the things we were telling you as a kid. This is actually the way that the truth is. We just kind of, wanted to play along for a while. They truly believe these things. Now, religions believe a lot of crazy stuff. And I'm not saying the religious beliefs are the thing that is dangerous in Scientology. Mormonism has a lot of strange beliefs. A lot of religions have their origin stories require faith. And that isn't the problem. The problem is with some of these teachings of adults in little bodies, referring to children like that, and then a very basic belief in Scientology that you are responsible for everything that happens to you. Now, looking at that from a self-help perspective as an adult, they say, hey, you're responsible for things in your life. That can be okay. There's some goodness to that. But when you take it to the nth degree, and saying you're responsible for everything that happens to you, that means you're responsible for any abuse that you've endured, any trauma that you've endured, you're responsible for that. Victim is almost like a 4-letter word in Scientology. If you're being called a victim, there's something wrong with you. So the idea of being a victim is one of the worst things that you could be in this group. That coupled with everything else, it opens itself up to a lot of child labor. And anyway, we'll get into some of those specifics, but that's just sort of the mental place that I found myself in as a child was I'm really an adult, even though I'm not, and I should be treated as such and utilized as such. And that is the mindset that you get with young children or even teens and adolescents in Scientology, is they think that they're fully developed when they aren't.
Yeah, and it also sets the parents up for believing the same thing, which puts their children at risk because in their minds, they think they're fully capable. They think they're fine. They don't end up raising their children in Scientology because of the brainwashing and indoctrination that these kids are totally fine. So you guys moved to California and then you were separated from your mom. So let's talk about how that affected you.
Absolutely. So my parents divorced. My mother ended up joining an upper level of Scientology clergy referred to as the C organization. These are the upper management levels and the ones that deliver the confidential levels of Scientology. She moved out to California, and with that kind of sold off all of our things, and I was plugged into this as a kid at the age of 10. While she was going through their version of boot camp, I was then put into what's called the cadet organization. This is where they have all their little cadets, similar to when people go to military academy before they join the army, but they're over the age of 18. Well, this is children from the age of 6 becoming like small members of the C organization and supposed to be being indoctrinated and trained to grow up and be these high level clergy members and executives in this organization. I went from this kind of middle class suburban existence with my family to then being raised by this organization and not even sleeping anymore with my mother. I was either sleeping kind of couch surfing with other families that were also in this organization or in a dormitory. And I would maybe see my mother for an hour a day if I was lucky. And once she finished her basic training in this organization, she went on to work for the leader's brother, a gentleman by the name of Ronnie Miscavige, David Miscavige's older brother, who was in charge of marketing in this organization. Within a year or so, she was moved to their confidential base that's out in Gilman Hot Springs, close to Hemet and San Jacinto, while I remained in LA. And I was in LA kind of by myself, kind of in this Lord of the Flies situation, as were a lot of other children whose parents were up at this international base. Probably 80 of us were down there, plugged in with a whole lot of other kids that were running around the streets of Hollywood or working for this organization, very loosely supervised and not being well educated. And that was like that for about a year and a half until I got moved up to a property closer to that base. And LA itself is not a great place to have a kid just running around on their own.
It's not a good place for anyone to be running around. I've lived there. I mean, well, I do live there, but I've lived on Hollywood Boulevard, pretty close to a few of the Scientology centers, and it's a sketchy place to be. Just walking my dog, I'm like, wow, should I be out here at noon? Because it's not safe.
Yeah, so there are a lot of gangs and gang violence in that area, and most of them did not like the Scientologists. So us as children, when we were walking around, we would be approached and attacked sometimes by gang members, kids that were a little bit older than us or our age, and it would devolve into physical violence very, very rapidly.
Oh, no.
So as my mother was working for these executives, and they also had children that were my contemporaries, we were growing up together, also down in this same location in LA, while they were several hours away from us at the international headquarters. Eventually, they moved us up to a children's ranch that was on the other side of the Soboba Native American reservation, about 20 minutes away from this confidential base. We weren't allowed to go to the confidential base, even though our parents were there, but they would come and visit us on the weekends. They moved, at first it was about 8 of us that got moved up to this ranch. We were about 13 years old. And we were selected mainly because we were going to be the workforce to renovate this property. It was an old, dilapidated property that needed a tremendous amount of work, and they were going to use the kids to be the workforce for it. And then as we got renovations completed, they then slowly brought up more and more kids and expanded the workforce so that within the course of about 2 years, the property was renovated and quite actually very, very nice in terms of a property itself. But they used us as labor in order to do that. It wasn't like they contracted the work, had it done, moved us up, and had us start doing schooling. We did physical labor. And then when we were doing educational schooling, it was mainly focused on Hubbard's teachings and not on a typical normal education that you would want your kids to get.
What was that like for you being the workforce? I imagine, I don't think I could build anything, and I'm an adult, but imagining a whole bunch of kids renovating a property, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. Was it fun for you? Was it hard?
Honestly, in public school, I was struggling a lot with my education. I had dyslexia, and I felt very bad about that, and it was something that I wanted to hide. The prospect of denying me an education at the time, I wasn't opposed to, because I didn't enjoy my normal schooling, and I really probably needed remedial education and I wasn't getting it. And then now I'm with some of my other friends and we're just doing construction work. There was a lot of that I actually enjoyed, but these were between the ages of 13 and 15 years old. I should have been doing middle school and the beginnings of high school, and I probably was still stuck at a 5th grade reading level and education and hadn't moved since I had been taken out of public school. So there were certain aspects of that I learned I learned a good work ethic. I learned a lot of construction skills. All of those things have certain benefits, but the drawbacks of that is now I'm undereducated and very beholden to this group. So I couldn't go out and get a normal job. Not that it was being offered to me. And at one point I wanted to leave and wasn't able to. They had every potential to have made that ranch property literally the best for the kids. Could have been a good education. We could have been away from downtown Los Angeles, which we were, kind of out in nature, doing a lot of great things. But when you involve it into Scientology and then the Sea Organization experience, it quickly devolved into a Sea Organization experience. Like I say, if you're a hammer, everything is eventually going to become a nail. So they don't have much use for children. And we were more or less an impediment and a problem that they ultimately just needed workforce, and they weren't interested in raising us.
Yeah.
The education that we were receiving for normal education was Hubbard referred to it as the 3 R's. It would be reading, writing, and arithmetic. So he wanted us to read with a 10,000 word vocabulary. That's why most of us are fairly well spoken. I eventually got past the dyslexia to the point where I could read well. He wanted us to be able to write swiftly, legibly, and elegantly. And then he wanted us to have basic arithmetic skills. So addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, but no higher mathematics, aside from some navigational principles, because at one point his organization was on a ship kind of hiding from Interpol and the FBI. So he's like, hey, we got to be able to navigate around. So he wanted the kids to be able to do that. And they just kind of stuck with that model. So it's really nothing past really what you would have through elementary and some basic, maybe 5th or 6th grade levels. Aside from the reading was pushed. And then a lot of that reading was Hubbard's technology, though, what we would focus on. So it was very isolating. You don't have a plug-in with the normal world. You never watch TV. Your existence is what's being given to you and shown to you. And kids are easily indoctrinated when you put them in that sort of position.
Mm-hmm. What were some of the rules like, or what was the daily life like aside from the construction on the ranch?
We were being monitored or controlled probably by about less than a half a dozen adults. So we were actually given positions in this organization as cadets and set up with our own little organization and rank structure. So you had the kids that were running each other. It kind of felt like a very organized version of Lord of the Flies. It's all along this kind of nautical naval profile that Hubbard was running this rest of this organization with. So we had a commanding officer, and then you'd have the various people that were in charge of the different functions in these organizations. And the idea was to kind of train you to become an executive in this group. So ethics would be one thing that was very strange is profanity is very loosely used in the Sea organization. Like dropping F-bombs, yelling at each other, swearing at one another in order to get work done. It was normal. And looking back at that, I was like, where did this sort of behavior come from? And if you think about it, if you're trying to pretend that you're military, people that have never been in the military assume that the military is always heavy discipline all the time, yelling at each other to get stuff done. And you get that a little bit in boot camp and basic training. And then after that, that's not the typical norm. But for lack of actual real experience in what things should look like, it seems like that profile was very much part of the existence in the Sea organization.
Right, which you would know because
now I'm in the Army.
You were in the military, or you are in the military. Yeah. So I just wanted everyone to know that you're not just making that up. You actually know.
Yeah, and I'll touch on some of that as we get into it. But yes, I am actually active duty military once I escaped the Sea organization. So our normal day-to-day was we're very much policing, running ourselves, enforcing things on each other. And then you still have the same interpersonal problems of kids get cliquey, want to do different things. You're going to have some kids that don't get along with others. And that often would result in a lot of disagreements. Kids, we were very tightly controlled. There was no dating allowed of any kind whatsoever. So now you have a bunch of kids, or about 80 of us, that are starting to hit puberty at a certain point and are not allowed to literally do anything. Scientology and the Sea organization is extremely sex negative culture. So as kids, as we're coming of age, we had no outlet. No one was talking to us about the birds and the bees. As kids would be wanting to just experiment personally, the whole subject of masturbation was very, very negatively approached. They would put you through interrogations and then publicly read out if you had done such a thing in front of other kids.
No.
Yeah. That kind of puts you in a very strange space, aside from just not having kids sleeping with each other, which was never allowed. And when it did happen, it was dealt with extremely forcefully, and the kids isolated, made to repent, shamed. But just the whole subject of growing up and normal desires were very much suppressed.
Yeah, let's dive into that a little bit, because I find it really interesting that there would be this heavy, I guess you could call it purity culture within something that's not religious at all. And there's no real, quote, sin, I guess you could say, like we've talked about in other cults or religions that specifically use the Bible to demonize sex. And so I'm wondering, does this just come, in your opinion, does this just come from the idea that kids are annoying and they don't want kids, and so let's just not tell them about sex? Or where does this come from?
So I think some of these beliefs and the things that get enforced as almost like scripture in Scientology. So anything that was ever said by L. Ron Hubbard, they take it as complete part of the doctrine and the text that has to be followed to the letter. There is a belief in Scientology that you have to follow Scientology and everything that is said by Hubbard to the T. There is no room for interpretation or deviation. And he's written thousands and thousands and thousands of things about everything under the sun, moon, and stars. So if you can imagine that you had every word in the Bible was all the red words from Jesus Christ, and it had to be followed perfectly and exactly all the time. But then imagine that there were 50 Bibles of all of the things that were ever said. Like, you have to follow this very regimented structure about everything. And back in the 60s, when he was on this ship and he had, a couple hundred people that were living on it, including some children were on there as well that were working as his messengers. You then had a culture back in, the 60s, early 70s that was kind of around the hippie days. At one point, from what I've heard, there was a lot of free love that was going on that boat. And he had to kind of squelch it. And so he put a lot of rules in place where you are not allowed to do these things. The way it was being enforced on us as kids, if we did anything at all, we weren't allowed to. But even if you reached an age in the Sea organization where you became one of their main staff and you were able to start dating, that was very tightly controlled. You were allowed to kiss, but not, they used a term which was heavy petting. And I didn't even understand really what the heck that meant.
So funny. Because we had that too. What is it with this old fashioned term? All of us growing up were like, what does that even mean?
So I guess it's like groping or touching, like anything, if like passionate kissing. So anything other than just a peck opened you up to the scrutiny of being in violation of these rules and doctrines that could land you in serious problems. So if you violated this, this isn't even going to we're talking maybe first base. You're halfway to first base. That's about how far you're allowed to go. And if you go anywhere past that, it's your ass. So we were terrified of it. I mean, I was so terrified of it all that I wanted to do nothing, even though there were girls that I felt very attracted to and all this sort of stuff. I just didn't even want to say anything about it. So I was terrified to even express an interest in another person.
What would the punishments be if you did cross the line?
So for us as cadets, you would be separated out because there were some kids that just couldn't help themselves and they ended up just going all the way. And they were isolated from the other kids, made to do heavy, heavy manual labor and treated like prisoners, almost put in a concentration camp kind of profile where they were in immense trouble. So, and then that was used as an example for everyone else. Like, you're not allowed to talk. You're not allowed to eat with anybody else. You're digging ditches in the hot California sun. You're shunned by everybody as you're sitting out there under 24-hour security watch. And this is the result of what's going to happen if you, as a teenager, do anything. Once you're in the Sea organization, if you would do anything heavy petting or beyond, they will send you to the Rehabilitation Project Force, which is the Sea organization Scientology gulag for people, where you could spend years, literally years, in this sort of confinement being reindoctrinated, and kind of thought reindoctrination is what they go through on that in order to then be able to rejoin the normal Sea organization and to have kind of a slightly less regimented rules imposed upon them. So I think your life would be torn apart and you would be thrown in jail almost, is the way that it felt if you just followed your desires for having, human interaction. And as a teenager, there's a lot going on. Thinking back on it now, I get like a physiological response to oh. So at a certain point, and I'll kind of get into that because I ended up getting married at a young age. But when I was 15, a lot of my other friends were starting to leave this cadet organization and go actually work in the Sea organization at the international base. They were granted the clearances in order to go and work there. Everything was great. And they were all moving off. And now I'm kind of one of the older kids that are there, but I had still this connection to my father because when my parents got divorced, I would have to go and visit him. Well, their security division said, hey, you need to deal with that, man. You can't have this external influence of going and visiting your father. You need to tell him you can't go anymore. So during one of the trips that I had taken to see him, I was supposed to handle him. So hey, Dad, I'm going to join this organization now and I can't come and keep visiting you. Well, this conversation obviously didn't go great. And then I was like, I'm miserable. I hate it. I've gotten no education. I feel like an idiot. I really would like to have a normal childhood. I would like to finish high school. I really want to join the military. I want to be a helicopter pilot when I grow up. I want to leave. And this was during a vacation where I was away from California back with him in Colorado. And they were like, okay, well, you can stay. My dad and my stepmom. But I was scared to just leave and not ever come back, because if you do, you can be labeled a suppressive person and pretty much excommunicated from them. And I wouldn't have any access to my mother, who was still working there at their international base. So I decided, hey, I want to go back. I want to leave properly, which you go through an interrogation process. You sign a bunch of things in order to say that you'll never speak badly about Scientology. And I'm like, hey, I want to do that so I can at least continue to have a relationship with my mother. She was my preferred parent, even though I was now wanting to go and live with my father now that I'm an older teenager, hoping that I could have a real life for myself. So I went back. The response to me going back and trying to leave properly was for them to put me on that same kind of lockdown that I had talked about, that they would put kids on if they, had sex, and isolate me from all of the other kids so that I didn't contaminate their thoughts. If one person wants to leave, other people might want to leave. And I was isolated, and I was heavily re-indoctrinated through this counseling e-meter process that they have. But they have another type of it, which is called a security check, which is really an interrogation where they're going in and just diving into what you have done wrong to want to leave. Because anybody who wants to leave only leaves because of their own crimes. And I obviously have crimes if I want to leave. So me as a 15-year-old, about 15 and a half, just short of 16, this is what I'm enduring. I put up with it and still wanted to leave until I was about 17 and a half. So the better part of a year and a half of this went on. And at which point they said, hey, you're almost 18 years old. You don't have much of an education. What do you think you're going to do now? I hadn't had any contact really with my father other than he would write me letters. I wasn't able to really respond. So I decided to stay. I felt like I had no other options. I felt like I wasn't intelligent enough to leave on my own. At this point, I was too old. So I decided to stay and tried to dedicate myself to work in this organization the way they wanted me to. And there was a girl there that was kind of in a similar situation of not sure if she wanted to leave. She and I had become close as we worked together over the years. Her name is Samantha. And I decided to stay and try to make a life for myself. Samantha and I kind of became a thing. I asked her if, we wanted to kind of go out. I don't really even know. I would be the worst guy to go into a bar and try to pick somebody up. I have like zero game. So that we're 100% clear. But then she was interested in me. I was interested in her. I asked her to marry me. We had never kissed before. So that we're clear at this point. I was just short of 18 years old. She was 16. We ended up getting married when I was 18 and she was still 16. We had to drive to Las Vegas to get married because in LA, you have to go through a bunch of paperwork. California is like, what the hell are you doing? But in Nevada, they're like, yeah, go ahead. We had notes from my mom and from her parents that made it okay. We got married. We ended up getting married at the Little White Chapel drive-through window in Vegas, which is like a converted McDonald's.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I've been there. I used to live in Vegas. Yeah.
Okay, so that's where I got married. We got married in her mother's crappy car, and we got married in that thing. And we were so young when we went and tried to stay in a hotel. We couldn't afford the places because we weren't old enough to gamble. So if you have gamblers rates, the rooms are cheap. If you're too young, you can't afford it. So we ended up staying at Circus because that's the only place that was really good enough for kids.
Good enough for kids. Oh, just like the picture of that is like, we just got married. We got to find a place that's good enough for kids. Wow, there's just so much to unpack there. And you said that this was off camera. You said that you had only known or dated for about 6 months before you decided to get married too, right?
6 months before we got married. We were engaged probably within a couple weeks after we started dating.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and then we just had to figure out the timing. A lot of that, in order for us to leave and go and get married, we had to take a leave of absence, which we were both staff members at this point. They interrogate you before you go on any sort of vacation to make sure you're not going to leave. They call it blowing, which leave without authorization. So that we had to go through this interrogation to go and get married. And some of the questions were like, do you plan on, Scientology has its own languages. Their word for like having sex out of marriage would be out 2D, which would be violation of the second dynamic, one of their urges towards survival. Do you plan on going out 2D on vacation? And so here I am, a kid that's never had sex before. I've only barely kissed this girl. And now I'm being asked if I'm going to go out 2D. And it read on this e-meter because I was like an emotional response. And they're like, are you going to go out 2D? And I'm like, okay, well, we're going to have a Scientology ceremony, but we're not going to be legally married before we go. We have to drive to Vegas to get legally married. I guess it would be out 2D if we stopped along the highway in Death Valley and had sex in the back of the car because we couldn't wait. So that would be the only way. And I don't plan on doing that. So is this whole interrogation, like, are you going to go out 2D? Is like, I have no idea what I'm doing. No one's had a birds and the bees conversation with me yet. We end up getting to Vegas. Now we have a hotel room. Now it's like, apparently we can do whatever we want. We didn't know what we were doing. We didn't consummate our marriage for 6 months after we were married.
Oh my God.
Like, it was not working out. Like, eventually everything got ironed out and we were, we were compatible as a couple. This whole experience that you would expect to be like, hot and sexy and all that, it was embarrassingly terrifying looking back on it now, because of just how underinformed and how we were in a situation where we should have just been kids that were maybe experimenting. And, like, me being 18 and her 16 was problematic, but anyway, it kind of was what it was, but it was a lot to deal with for her and for me in order to go through all this. But that's kind of how young teenagers, when you're in the Sea organization and you're getting married in the Sea organization is akin to dating. Like, you can't do anything unless you're married. So very often Sea organization members are getting married, finding out they're not compatible with somebody. One of the person ends up getting in trouble or wants to leave. They get divorced. They marry somebody else. The dating pool is only within that organization. So there's some people that have been married multiple times to, like, it gets very, I think, inbred, messy for sure. Not inbred because they're not having children, but it would have the potential for that if they actually were extremely rapidly.
Yeah, that's a lot. And I'm sorry that you had to go through that. Because it's true, when you're that young, you're just supposed to be discovering sexuality in general, not be tasked with figuring out how to do it on your own within the context of a marriage. It's too much. I don't know how anyone hasn't figured out, hey guys, maybe this is a bad idea and we should let kids be kids. I mean, I don't know. I guess as I say that, I'm like, duh, Shelise, that you feel that way about every person that you interview. It's like every religion or high control group, they all have the same ridiculous rules and they just don't allow humans to have human experiences and they demonize everything. So I guess that's a moot point. But speaking out loud, it's just crazy. And I wish it could be different for people. And you have a lot to talk about as far as what went on within your marriage as well, because even once you get married, sex is still in some ways demonized because of their views on children.
Absolutely.
And so however much you're comfortable talking about that, we can go there.
Sure. So she and I continued to work in this organization for the next 10 years. And I worked in various positions, either in kind of management assistant, kind of manager positions. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But while we were married, we had buffed out the whole problem on like how to have sex. And then we're trying to just have protected sex so that she wouldn't get pregnant. In the Sea organization, you're not allowed to have children. About the time that I had arrived as a kid, when I was 10, a policy came out that says no one's allowed to have kids anymore. If you have a kid, you're going to be kicked out of the organization and sent to one of these small failing organizations somewhere in the world, and you're not going to be allowed to be in the Sea organization. So you're going to lose access to your friends and the people that you know because you wanted to have a child. What ends up happening, because they have a very small population of people that work there, is the couples are coerced to terminate the pregnancy if somebody gets pregnant. And if people are having sex, you're going to end up with a pregnancy. Now, over the course of the almost 10 years that we were married, she got pregnant 2 times. The first time that she got pregnant, we had no idea what to do. She was just barely 20 and I was probably 22. She got pregnant and we were like, we're going to lose access to everybody that we know if we're kicked out of here. What are we going to do? I mean, I've already established that we're undereducated. We have to work in this organization. If we leave, what are we going to do for ourselves? So we were encouraged to get an abortion, and I drove her to an abortion clinic, probably a short distance away. They would move which clinics they were using around because all of us had the same mailing addresses. So if multiple people from the same mailing address are showing up to these clinics, even the clinics start to get like a little concerned, like what is going on here? And it looks really bad. So they'd send us to different ones around the LA area. Going to that experience, going to the clinic and actually going through with that, depending on which side of the aisle you sit on with respect to the moral dilemma that is the termination of a pregnancy, it is extremely hard on the people that are living through that, whether they are getting it because they for whatever reason. It is very, very traumatic. There were a lot of protesters outside. The signs that they have are horribly disgusting, and as we go in there, it feels like the most impersonal violation that I had ever experienced. And then we're going there because we had to. She went through this procedure, came out, was in a lot of pain, which is fairly typical. And you aren't able to really figure out, is this something that we truly wanted or didn't want? It was that it was required by the organization to do it. To this day, it's hard for me to emotionally reconcile all of the different thoughts and emotions that pour in as a result of that, because I feel like we never were able to really decide for ourselves if this is something that was right for us or not right for us. So what I can tell you is that an organization that is enforcing this on their members, that is not the correct place for the conversation. It's a deeply nuanced, complicated conversation and shouldn't be being demanded by an organization that you work for that's calling themselves a religion that's demanding its staff members do this. The second time that she had to get this, I was kind of not in good standing with the organization, and I was restricted to their base, and she was taken by someone else to terminate the pregnancy because I wasn't allowed to leave the property because I had fallen out of favor with Religious Technology Center, and I wasn't even allowed to be there with her when this happened. So I had at one point even contemplated, like, so that this didn't keep happening, like, should I get myself sterilized so that this doesn't happen anymore because of how horrible it felt? That thought was actually because some people decided to go and actually like get a vasectomy so that it wouldn't happen, and they would just take that off the table so they wouldn't have to deal with it, as almost a show of commitment to the organization. And that thought was going around in my head. And I remember talking to my senior at the time. He advised me against it. Because he had been through the similar stuff. He's like, what if the rules change at some point? What if you're able to actually have a kid? And you probably shouldn't do that. And this is just a human talking to another human, but other people had considered that same thing. So this is the thought process you find yourself in as a member of that organization, which I don't know how you would ever be put in such a situation. It doesn't have any parallel that I can possibly even imagine on anything else, but it's extremely cruel and unusual.
Yeah, that's devastating. Being forced to do something like that is unimaginable and so wrong on so many levels. And I'm just so sorry that you both had to go through that.
I appreciate the support. I wish that the story was unique to me. I wish that it was only something that I had to endure, but it's not. I know of dozens of other marriages, if you're families, if you want to call them that, because it all felt very impersonal now that I'm out of it. Our actual, what was our marriage, what was our existence. But this is common. This is not uncommon in this organization that girls of all ages are put, and women are put in this situation of having to do that. And a lot of times the woman will have to make the decision, or, you'll be placed in confinement until that happens, or forced to leave when this is the only life that you've known while you've been kind of sequestered away from normal society. It's a very, very complicated situation to be put in. And I think it's a very destructive part of this organization that needs exposed.
Yeah. And also, I just want to point out for those who may be thinking, well, if I was in that situation, I would just leave. There's so much more that goes into that, because you have the brainwashing and the indoctrination that tell you you're not going to make it if you leave, or you don't have any options, or what are you going to do? How are you going to make money? Where are you going to live? And already, I mean, I can tell you as someone who's pregnant right now, ready to pop at any moment, that you're already going through so much emotionally, physically. I can't even imagine being in that situation where my physical safety is at jeopardy, let alone my emotional safety and just being okay. I feel like there's so much more that goes into that. And I remember with the interview with Claire, who had to go through the same thing, she was saying that even if someone tried to hide it and not tell them that they were pregnant, that they would still be forced to terminate the pregnancy later, late term. And or if they found out, they would put the women through hard labor to try and induce a miscarriage, which is, it makes me emotional, obviously, because I'm pregnant too, but it's just so wrong on so many levels. And so I just wanted to add that context for those who are thinking, well, why didn't you just leave? It's always so much more complicated and nuanced than that.
It is. And, and I'm not trying to take a position on one way or the other on the ethics of this. I'm just trying to say that the decision of the ethics for this should not be being made by an organization operating as a corporation that is disguising themselves as a religion. Like, that's about the worst place that the decision should be being made. Kind of going along with that and moving a little of my story along with it, at a certain point, and there's a lot of things that go into why I ended up leaving. The abortions were definitely a major component of it, as I was drifting more and more away from a belief in Scientology and in its management, specifically of their leader, David Miscavige. At a certain point, my wife, who was one of the people that worked directly for Miscavige, she was the makeup artist that would do his makeup at all of their events. She would do the makeup for their movies and stuff that they create for their internal propaganda. She would handle the haircuts for RTC, which is the Religious Technology Center. It's the organization that David Miscavige has run, kind of the upper level for Scientology. He was getting a haircut once from this professional they would have come up from Los Angeles. He asked if the guy wanted to have him wash his hair before he came down to this full makeup studio that includes hair washing stations. So if you imagine like a fully loaded salon, this is what's going on. So the professional just said, have him come down. Well, he came down, and then the guy washed his hair, and Miscavige didn't like that because, he didn't think he was going to have his hair washed, and absolutely lost it on my wife. Screaming at her. She was in all sorts of trouble, like just telling her what an absolute piece of shit she was for this interaction that happened, which makes no sense whatsoever. But this is kind of the normal day-to-day of no matter what you do, you're going to do something wrong. So when this happened, she came to me later that evening and she explained it all to me. And she's like, I want to get out of here. She was shaking. She was just terrified. She's like, we should leave. And I was like, let's go. Like, the only reason why I was still staying there after all of these years and everything that we had been through, which I could take an hour just telling you about that, working long hours, sleep deprivation, it was horrible. But when she told me we wanted to leave, I'm now 27 years old. A lot of time has passed, but I was like, we can leave. I will get us out of here. I still want to join the military. I want to have a normal life. Let's go. Let's pack a bag and get out of here tonight. She thought about it for a bit. This is to kind of go back to what you had said about how hard it is for somebody to give all this up. Her whole family was there. Her mother, all of her cousins, everything that she had ever known. She was born in this organization. She said, if I end up leaving, I'm going to ultimately probably come back. If that happens, we're going to probably end up getting divorced. So we should just stay. When she said that to me, that when we should leave, she would end up just wanting to come back, and that our marriage was so temporary for her that it didn't mean what it meant to me, that was the turning point for me. I was like, I'm done. At least in my mind, I didn't tell her I'm done and just leave. But a couple days later, when I was out doing some manufacturing, I was working for their manufacturing division at this point, doing print production. I just almost spur of the minute decided I'm out of here, and I left. And drove right to Ontario Airport in Southern California, bought a one-way ticket to go and find my father, who lived in Colorado. I hadn't spoken to him since I decided to stay because I had been disconnected from him, and got on the plane without making any contact with anybody at the other end. I got to Denver, got a hold of a family friend, that one person that just never moves. They were still there, was able to track him down, and then started to try to put my life back together at this point when I'm 27 years old with barely a GED, no credit record, no experience on anything outside of Scientology, having to start from scratch. That was very hard.
Yeah. What a shock. Did you have to, or did you, before you got on the plane, try and file the divorce and get that settled, or was that just still pending?
So the conversation happened where she said she had wanted to leave and then probably would end up coming back. Then 2 days later, I just on a whim decided to leave. There was no divorce. I had still hoped that she would come and she would decide to leave and come and be with me. I left before they could lock me down and keep me from doing so.
Yeah.
I was used to what that process looked like because I would be used sometimes on the recovery teams when other people would leave to try to get them back. So I knew exactly what the security measures would be, and I knew how to get around them very rapidly. So I left, and
that's right.
It was a shock. Yeah.
I totally forgot. It's like, it's not just something that you can't tip off anybody. And I don't know how I forgot that, because they will physically detain you and not allow you to leave. Yeah. So, of course, that makes total sense. So when you got to your dad's, what's his reaction to you seeing you? Is he still practicing Scientology at this point?
No, he wasn't practicing Scientology anymore. He's kind of in a new age, weird spirituality, whatever he was into. But he had kind of moved on with his life. I had a a kid sister that was like 10 years old that I had never met before. And I kind of just showed back up into their lives and was like having to kind of reintegrate with them. They were very welcoming. My dad and my stepmom kind of just, took me in and helped me get back on my feet. I was massively sleep deprived. I was usually sleeping an average of a couple hours a night, just working. So I spent the first several weeks just kind of, doing stuff around the house and sleeping in, eating normally, kind of just getting my head on straight. And then I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do when I grew up at that point. I had tried to get, to do some of the manufacturing stuff that I was doing in Scientology, realized that I didn't like that at all. And then within about 6 months, I decided that I wanted to get myself back on the same path that I wanted to follow when I was 15. I was now 27, significantly older, but I wanted to join the military. So I went to the recruiters and I was able to go through the process of joining the military. As strange as it would be, joining the military at 27 years old and just enlisting is old. It's not normal. But I had gone through a lot of life experience, and factually the amount of indoctrination, this kind of military, quasi-military or, paramilitary existence that the Sea Organization was, had me very well accustomed to dealing with what the military would be dishing out. So the actual mental stresses of military service were something less than I was used to, but the actual job requirements and the physical requirements were significantly more, and I had to get used to that. But the hardest thing is the mental stuff. The physical stuff is the easy part. The mental stuff is what's hard. So the abuse that I had endured through almost 20 years of being in Scientology and the Sea Organization made it very easy for me to transition to military life. And that was almost a seamless change for me. And it was really an effort for me because through this whole process, my wife ended up disconnecting from me. My mother disconnected from me. She filed for divorce, through the organization. And there's a lot to cover there, but it wasn't like the two of us talking. I never spoke to her again once I left. It was all being done through their legal departments and their Office of Special Affairs. All of that was handled by Scientology. It was never a communicate. We never spoke again. Even though I was trying to, they would never put her on the phone. And we ended up getting divorced. I got the divorce papers when I was in basic training. Just is what it is. Kind of shitty, but I just buckled down and tried to compartmentalize everything that had happened in my life up to that point behind me. And I just focused then on my existence in the military for the better part of the next 20 years. My mother was still there. I had lost contact with her and we had no real connection up until more recently. But at this point, I've gone from a nobody in the military and slowly worked my way up to being able to go to warrant officer candidate school, to go to flight school. I've become a helicopter pilot. I've got a lot of experience. I've become a helicopter instructor pilot and senior trainer. So I've gone through 20 years of military service, 3 deployments to Afghanistan, 2 deployments to Iraq, and really made the life for myself that I intended to have. But there was always this previous part of my life that I had just sort of segmented away, which my mother still being there, I never wanted to speak out because I didn't want to make it harder for her, and was naive enough to think that she was there doing what she loved, what she believed in, and that she was being well taken care of. And that was naive of me to think that, but I was also kind of unindoctrinating myself a bit at a time while I left one cult and then arguably joined another cult called the United States Army. But it was left a lot more opportunity for advancement and individual success than my previous life did. It's a little tongue in cheek. I love the Army. The high control group is what I was used to. So it almost was easy for me. It was the easy button, which most people would think military service, that would be the worst thing. But for me, it was easier than a normal civilian existence. I don't know if that would have actually been true because I didn't try it, but that's how I feel about it.
It's definitely interesting. It would be really fun to get you and Daniela Mestenek-Young on a call together. So she was from Children of God and joined the military, and she said the same thing.
I know her husband.
Oh, you do?
Her husband, Tom, and I actually, we fly the same helicopter. We went through flight school together.
Oh my gosh. Have you had a conversation with Daniela before?
We've texted because Tom and I are Facebook friends, and we have been. We hung out in flight school together.
What are the odds?
And
that is so cool.
I've recently recorded because Daniela did an interview also with Stephen Hassan, who wrote the book Combating Cult Mind Control. So she went on and actually shared her experience from a female that came from the Children of God, which was she endured a lot of sexual abuse, which I was almost on the puritanical opposite end of the spectrum with that, with Scientology. But what she endured, and then her being a female going from that into the military, her experiences in the military are very accurate and relevant for exactly what she went through in her life. So yes, Steve Hassan and I have actually recorded an interview that should be being published here shortly. This kind of a response to Daniela's that both supports what she said and then also gives my perspective from Scientology, coming from kind of this military cult. Joining the military and also me being male is very different than a female's time in the army too. So it's sort of contrasting those two things together, but not necessarily in competition to what she said, but more like reinforcing it, but just giving another perspective, because I have more of a pro-military take on it than she has, which is more of a negative experience, rightfully so. So her book is amazing, Uncultured. If anyone hasn't read it, they should.
So good. So good. I love that you're validating her experience. We did a whole episode on the military side of things after leaving Children of God. And some people, it seemed like the people who were most upset were never in the military, and the ones who were like, yeah, that makes sense, had those experiences or had seen those things happen in the military. So it's nice to hear you validating her experience and supporting her point of view, as well as having your own perspective, which is totally fine. So, oh my gosh, wow, so funny, small world. And I'm excited to listen to your interview with Steve Hassan. Okay, so moving forward then, you said that you were a little bit naive as to what was going on with your mom. How did you actually end up noticing or realizing that she wasn't safe there anymore?
So again, I didn't have communication with her from leaving. Occasionally, I might have heard of her being in contact with a family member, one of her family members from, my extended family, her brothers and sisters that I had now been in contact with. But for the most part, she and I had no communication with each other for the entire time that I had been out. So for the last 20 years, I really didn't know what she was up to. What ended up happening was in 2021, I got a call from one of my uncles that said, hey, your mother is in the ICU. She's had a stroke. She's probably going to pass. She was there at Cedar Sinai. Actually, it was Hollywood Presbyterian. She was at Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital. That's like 2 blocks away from the big blue building in Hollywood where she was working. And I kind of jumped through everything to get out there as fast as I could and to try to just be there for her and to hopefully be able to say goodbye before she passed away. It took me about a day and a half to get out there. It was during a lot of snowstorms and stuff. I live on the East Coast, and we were, it was in February, so it wasn't easy to get out. But I did get to Hollywood. It was kind of during COVID, so there were a lot of hospital restrictions, but I went there during visiting hours, was able to get in there and see her. And by the time I got there, she had started to improve slightly. She was originally unconscious. By the time I arrived, she was actually starting to come to and starting to recover a little bit, but was still in very, very bad shape. They thought she had had a stroke, but what ended up happening was she was actually extremely dehydrated. She had very bad pneumonia. And she also had, in 2011, had to have triple bypass surgery, which was paid for by the state of California, wasn't paid for by Scientology. And then after that, really received no follow-up cardiac care for the last 10 years. So she had a lot of health conditions, but she was still working a full schedule, 24/7, 365 is the Seerg member's lifestyle. You get time to sleep, but that's about it. She was working there for that entire time while she was over the age of 65. And I didn't know any of this, but when I went out there, we started, talking. I would come for about a 5-day period and just sit with her by her bed. And she started sharing some of what she was going through with me. And we still thought that she was probably going to pass. What was also strange is while I was there in the hospital, I didn't have any legal connection to her. And what I mean by that is all of their members are made to actually sign over power of attorney to the medical department that runs their organization. So they have medical liaison officers, which are just people, they're probably not even nurses, but they're just in charge of getting people to their medical appointments. These were the people that had literal signed power of attorney for her. So they had her legal power. I had no power to even help her at that point. So I stayed there as long as I could with her. At a certain point, I had to get back to my life in the military, but we still expected her to pass. We said our goodbyes at that time. I thought we'd never be able to see each other again, and she was still in the ICU. I wasn't able to call because their medical staff from Scientology would usually be there to answer the phones. So we're kind of going to see what was happening at this point. About 2 or 3 months after that, I get an email from her that she's like, hey, I'm doing better. I'm in this place in Glendale. She had been put in a hospice facility. At first, I was reluctant to even answer the email because I thought it was maybe Scientology trying to poke around and mess with me or something. But I had found out she was put in hospice. When she was there, she was originally very terrified of even being away from Scientology. She'd spent the last 35 years in this organization. And while she was there, she slowly taught herself to use the internet, started looking around online, and started closely looking for the progress Scientology is saying to all their staff members that it's making. She's trying to look for these great works. She wasn't finding it, but what she was finding was a lot of people speaking out about Scientology abuse, people that she knew from all of her time working there with all of these executives to be credible. And then she started kind of slowly removing her own indoctrination that was put over her by kind of doing her own research bit by bit. The hospice facility that they put her in was significantly better than the way that she was living when she was at the Big Blue building in Hollywood, but it was still not that great. But they wanted her off campus because they were scared that if she died on their installation, they would have to call medical services. Medical services would see how their staff are living. They had all these adults were in a room jammed in there with a bunch of bunk beds. So they had elderly seniors that were sleeping on bunk beds in this room that had no heating or ventilation. And that was just the way that they were living, just stuffed in. And people would work there until they died. And that was what was going on. So she also started slowly sharing with me some of the financial crimes that had been perpetrated on her, which we really didn't find out fully about until we were able to help her escape. So the escape story for her is fairly interesting. When a person leaves this high control organization of the Sea organization, you can leave in 3 ways. You can leave on their terms, which is through their interrogations and indoctrination, getting you to sign away all of your rights. That's the way that they would have you leave if you wanted to. The other option is to die, which is what we were expecting would happen with her and what the Sea Org was hoping would happen with her. And then the other option is to depart without their permission, to escape. They call it blowing, which is a very strange term for it. It was a Hubbard term, but they say, hey, if you've blown, an unauthorized departure is a blow. So now I have this elderly woman that's in California that I don't have any legal rights to that wants to leave. Once she'd realized, she watched all the documentary stuff that Leah Remini had done about Scientology. That didn't remove the indoctrination as much as the documentary that was based off of the book by Lawrence Wright. Alex Gibney did a documentary, Going Clear, Scientology and the Prison of Belief. That for her showed her that Hubbard was a complete and total nut. What he was promising was untrue, and then she needed out of there. So for that, at that moment, she was like, I'm done. I need to get out of here. But now, how do you do that with a person that requires oxygen, you don't have a legal ability to help? So I had to slowly figure that out over the course of the next 4 to 6 months. I had a close friend who is actually L. Ron Hubbard's granddaughter. We had grown up together. Her name's Roanne. She had kind of posed as one of my cousins, Allison, to go into this place to bring her papers, get her to sign them. And then we got these things notarized, sent back to me, and I was slowly able to get power of attorney for her. There's a organization called the Aftermath Foundation that exists to help people financially who don't have a means to help themselves to get away from Scientology and get reestablished in the outside world. The foundation helped to fund the transport and also setting up the senior care living for her at the other end to get her out of there. And then we just had to schedule a time to be able to get in and get out before their security would find out that we're springing her from this installation. She was free to go. It was kind of an outpatient place. So it wasn't like I stole her out of an old folks home. We were able to get her out. And what was funny was the 2 friends that helped me get her out. One was Roanne, that's L. Ron Hubbard's granddaughter. And the other one is my friend Justin, who is David Miscavige's nephew. So a Miscavige and a Hubbard helped me get my mother out of there.
That's amazing.
Which there's some poetic justice, I think, to that. Yeah.
Yeah. And your mom, how is she doing now?
She's doing quite a bit better. What we found out was she was just being worked to death and she wasn't being cared for. Once she was actually got proper medical treatment, got on the right medication, was on oxygen therapy, she started to improve, and she improved to the point of us being able to get her and transport her out of there. She still has to be on oxygen, but she's doing much, much better. She's in a very good facility that has a lot of life enrichment opportunities for her. Her mind is still in great shape, but her body is badly broken because of the fact that she wasn't taken care of for all of the time that she was a senior there after she had that heart surgery. So she has certain damage that is non-reversible. So every day that we have together is a bit of a gift. One thing that we found out in full once we got her out of there, and this is where I go back to kind of wanting to beat myself up a little bit about how I was naive about the abuse that she was enduring when she was there. She had been placed shortly after I escaped. She had been placed on what was called the Rehabilitation Project Force, which is their thought reconditioning camp that they have for Sea Org members. She was put onto this because she had been victimized as a staff member by an executive who was engaging in a lot of quid pro quo sexual harassment, sexual assault things. And when it was discovered that this executive was doing that to her, she was disciplined. She spent 6 years on this program. She was about 65. She started it when she was about 59 and didn't get off of it until she was 65. And then almost immediately thereafter is when she had to have the bypass surgery. After the bypass surgery, a couple things. One, they did not pay her copay on her medical bills. They were leaving that to the state of California to pay for those things. So they weren't providing her the basic things that Sea Org members are promised, which you're supposed to have all your medical, all your personal needs are covered. And then you're supposed to be given all of the benefits of Scientology training and auditing, all of those counseling levels to get up to the highest levels of spiritual enlightenment in Scientology. A Sea Org member is supposed to receive for free. Well, she started to receive Social Security payments when she was 65. And, so those are a couple, about $1,500 is coming in for that a month. Plus she had a small pension from before she joined the Sea organization that she was receiving. So as this money started coming in, slowly Scientology has realized like they have less people showing up to be Scientologists now because of the exposure they're getting on the internet, but they still are trying to make money. It's all about making money for this organization. It's a week by week thing. They have to make money. They have to make money. It's pay to play scheme, even though they have religious tax exemption, which is a mystery to me. Anything you want to do in Scientology, you can have nothing unless you pay for it. So she's a Sea organization member. She should be getting all of this benefit for free. Well, after she had gotten the heart surgery, she was left suffering by herself without proper medical care in a room trying to recover in this big blue building.
Oh my gosh.
And by herself, not even being fed all the time. And she thought she was going to die. And she was just absolutely miserable. They came to her offering her the benefits of Scientology auditing if she would pay for it. So they knew that she was now receiving a certain amount of money and it was starting to accumulate in her bank account. So they're like, well, let's go ahead and get that money from her. And so now let's sell her the stuff she's supposed to get for free. And then we'll feed her, we'll dust her off, we'll give her that auditing. They had done that to her. They had her donating money to the International Association of Scientologists, which is kind of their war chest for attacking members who want to speak out against them, hiring PIs, handling legal fees, all this sort of stuff is paid for by that donations pool. They were having her donate money to that. Once she was out of money, they started opening up credit cards in her name or charging other staff members credit cards for more of this auditing. Any money that she had got when her mother passed away and she got an inheritance, they took all of that money for the same thing. They were just opening up credit cards, even though she didn't want them, to pay for auditing for her that she should have gotten as a matter of course. Over a 10-year period, when she was a senior, she had over $163,000 that was harvested and siphoned off from her accounts, or that was opened and she had as financial liability that she was left to pay for by Social Security payments. I wish I could say that what I'm describing to you would only happen to her, but every single old person that was in the same situation, or anyone who was elderly that had some sort of inheritance or money or anything in that Sea organization, they were taking this money from them in the same kind of schemes of what I've described to you right now. She helped me compile a list of other, elderly in the same sort of situation, and it's dozens and dozens and dozens of people. So when I found this stuff out, I'm like, this is unbelievable. Like, this is horrible. Like not only, and this is why I have a lot of guilt with letting her be there, thinking she's happy in her religious freedom of doing whatever she wants to do. And this is what she was having to endure. I feel a sense of responsibility for not being smarter about this and realizing how horrible she could have been being treated. Hindsight being 2020, I try to think the best of people until I have a reason not to, and I didn't think that anyone would stoop to this level. The fact that they did is just unbelievable.
Yeah.
The most vulnerable members of society, children and the elderly, are the ones that get treated the absolute worst in Scientology. And if it's not benefiting them, having money coming in the door, they will step all over anyone in between there in order to get what they want. It's beyond belief. That is why um, my mother and I are sharing our family's story, because I wish this was unique to us. I wish the abuse that I had endured as a child was unique to me. I wish the abortions that my ex-wife and I had to deal with were only us. I wish that the elder abuse that my mother endured for over a decade while they took everything from her and worked her to death was only unique to her. But it is not in any way. There are all sorts of people in the exact same situation that do not have the ability to either get out of that because they still are believing in this cult and its belief system, and what it is promising to them, even though they are empty promises. So I know I try not to get too emotional. I'm good at compartmentalizing, but sometimes when I start talking about this, I start to get irritated and upset, which is hard not to. But this is why we want to speak out. This is why we want to share this truth. And what's remarkable, and we've shared all this information with federal authorities. The FBI has I've documented all this stuff down to the penny now that we've been able to get her out, get her financials and all of this. They have all of the information. They have the ability to know all of this. It's a matter of, on a political scale at this point, district attorneys, politicians saying, hey, we need to look into the tax exempt nature of this organization and other organizations that are cults. Like, to just, and I don't know enough about Mormonism to trash Mormonism.
I do.
But I know that you do, and that's your purview. The difference between Mormonism being an established and almost irrefutable part of the religious fabric of this society is 100 years. If you think about it, like the shit that was going on long ago, if the internet existed with Mormonism, it probably would have gotten stopped before it got out of control. But now it is at the point where it's part of the fabric of the society. And Scientology have let to continue doing this for long enough. It just becomes an established religious sect within the United States. And like, you can't get rid of it. It's almost, it's like a roach infestation. It's just there. It's always been there. You're never going to be able to get rid of it. And it just becomes masked in these other potential religious movements that exist when it is very much a for-profit organization. So, if there was the ability to kind of turn back the clock and look at these things for what they were, like, what are the fruits that they bring forward? Are they good or are they not? There's a lot of things in Scientology that people gravitate towards it because it provides solutions to problems at an entry level. They get people in the door with things that are very self-helpy. They're able to address specific problems in their life. And then it's like that frog that you're boiling in a pot of water. He goes into a cold pot of water. He doesn't realize it until it's too late as they turn up the heat on this. And then before you know it, it's every part of your life. So that's what ends up happening with people that come in at these entry level. There's a lot, like, people wouldn't be involved in Scientology if it was all complete bullshit. But there's a lot of raisins in the poop, and then people are like, oh, look at all this great stuff. But there's a lot bad about it too. And what's unique about Scientology is what you understand it to be at that entry level. It is very different once you get up to the upper levels. The basic Scientologist has no idea what Scientology is actually about until it's too late.
And I feel the same way about Mormonism. I mean, it's not nearly as abusive as Scientology physically. Emotionally, mentally, psychologically, it is very abusive. And once you climb up the ladder, when you get to the temple, you're like, wait, what religion am I in? Because they're dressed and it's a whole thing, temple ceremonies. But I think with Scientology, the way that it is purposely targeting and exploiting the most vulnerable populations, as you mentioned, the children and the elderly, is so disgusting. And most cults do this, but to the level that Scientology is exploiting the elderly by signing them up for credit cards and literally just taking their money, is so disgusting and wrong. And I'm so glad that you're speaking out about this. I'm glad that your mom is willing to speak out, because it's also a very vulnerable thing to be like, yeah, I was taken advantage of in this way. And I mean, bless her for being willing to even talk about her experience, because it feels very exposing when you're willing to talk about something like that. And she's just the sweetest lady. I saw some of the videos on your channel. I'm like, oh, Rosemary, you are just so sweet. I want to meet Rosemary.
Yeah,
Maybe
she's
I'll
great.
go visit her. Is she still in LA?
No, I have her. She's now in Pennsylvania with me, so we got her out of there.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah, so she's
go
far
visit
away
her.
from LA, but we can set up a call so you can say hi at some point. I'm sure she would absolutely love that.
Yeah,
But
that would be awesome.
But I would say your basic everyday Scientologists, they are very, very altruistic people that want good for the society. They think they are doing all of this because Scientology represents the only path to spiritual salvation. They really think that their dedication is making a difference. And what's unfortunate is then when you see what actually is then transpiring and how badly they're being taken advantage of, it's very maddening. The average Scientologist is very, very, very nice. You know, like the nicest people I've ever met in the world, because a lot of Mormons are actually in the military. Every Mormon friend I have, they're the nicest people ever. Like you'll never meet a Mormon that's not nice. But in Scientology, you also have the everyday Scientologists. They're very, very nice people. They and then you have a few exceptions of that when you have some very bad apples that are in the management sphere of that. They can weaponize something that already kind of is opened up to weaponization very, very effectively. And that's kind of what's occurred, I think, over the last couple of decades with Scientology, is you had a lot of very radical thoughts that were created by Hubbard that have been doubled down on by the current leader of the organization. He's turned it, something that was already tending towards abusive into the worst possible version of itself.
Mm-hmm. Something we often talk about is systems, not people, because it's true that on the very basic levels, if you were to walk into any Mormon church or Scientology building, they're just super nice and they want what's best for you and they truly want to save your soul. And that's not to say that what they're doing is vindictive. They genuinely think they're helping you. It's the systems that have been put in place that have created this mentality that causes them to manipulate people without them even realizing it, and causes them to do these things and put them in the position where it does become an abusive environment. And those are the patterns that we like to point out, because we get a lot of people who are active within these different groups that we speak about, and they're like, that's not my church. It's all about love and family and acceptance. And to a certain degree, yes, but we have to recognize the patterns put in place, the doctrines put in place, the rules, and the things that do ultimately create an environment that is ripe for predators, that blames the victims, that doesn't actually help the people who are involved when something goes wrong. And those are the things that we're trying to call out. I'm not personally trying to take down Mormonism. I don't think it's going anywhere. I mean, at least for a long time. I mean, we're talking about corporations. They've got at least $300 billion, this church. This is a huge corporation. They're not really going anywhere. But what we want to call out are these patterns and these programs that are negatively affecting the membership. And if the membership can stand up and say, no, we're not going to stand for this, if they knew what was going on, maybe they could stand up for themselves and hopefully make some changes. Now, I don't feel the same way about Scientology. I feel like they should be taken down because there's too much. There's too much going on there. And I feel like it's kind of on the brink. I feel like what you guys are doing, SPTV, Aaron Smith-Levin, everyone who is speaking out is doing a great job of exposing all of this. And I don't think they can last forever like Mormonism. So, I mean, just keep doing what you're doing. It's great.
Yeah. I mean, if I would say set a goal for what I would like to see, I mean, I have noticed that when the world outside of Scientology is complaining about the specifics or what's going on in Scientology, they try to pretend it's not true, which then usually results in immediately for some degree of improvement for the people that are still inside. So when I'm calling out the fact that they have old people on bunk beds, I'm hoping that this week or the first time I mention it, they're like, oh, we got to show that Mike Brown asshole that he's wrong and let's get these old people off bunk beds quick. Like I hope that's what they're doing. And I hope they then stop taking money from people. But what I would like to do is if Scientology wants to exist, because, I'm very pro, First Amendment, I'm in the military, but I've seen that that's been also very much weaponized, the whole freedom of religion. So I don't have a problem with Scientology existing, but I don't think it should exist as a religion. They are a self-help organization that wants to provide some sort of counseling about that. I think they should lose their religious status, and they should, if they're going to exist as a corporation to make money, I think they should have to do that on their own merits. And they either reform and change,
Yep.
or they cease to exist. But they can't exist the way that they exist now, because you continue to see that it continues to be abusive. So there's not one traumatic event for one person that is less important than any other one. The fact that it is still occurring is a problem. So the fact that there are so many of them, and it's a growing body of evidence that shows that there's a lot of bad things going on, I think they need to be open to some scrutiny and review, and that needs to be taken seriously by the legislation before they have it devalue into things that are even worse on the abusive level. And we see, more abuse, more death, more things of this nature that can't abide it. It's got to change.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think you figured it out. I guess we don't have to completely take them down, but if you
I think they'll take
cut off their
themselves
money
down.
supply, yeah, it'll eventually just crumble, and then we don't have to do anything about it. So this has been so awesome. Thank you so much for sharing everything, and your story, your mom's story, everything that you're doing to help this organization be held accountable is so great. Is there anything that you want to share about how you're doing your peace, your consciousness, your happiness?
I would say that I'm very happy with my life post Scientology that I've created for myself. I'm, finding peace in my family, my children. Now that I have children, it's helping me quantify and understand what kind of existence I had as a child, trying to make sure that they're not living through my trauma the way that I lived through my father's. So that's forefront in my mind for me to kind of be cognizant about that. I'm just happy to kind of have my own existence and be able to leave soon enough to be able to do something about it. If I would have waited forever, I would have lost a lot of opportunities. If I would have tried to leave in my 30s, not my 20s, I couldn't have joined the military. I would have been too old. But I'm happy with where I'm at now. This speaking out against Scientology it's not easy. It doesn't feel good. It takes additional time that we don't always have in our days for the people that want to get out there and talk about what is important. But I think it's important that we do it so that it raises awareness, so that when somebody does a Google search on Scientology, they don't just see the Scientology propaganda, they can see the experiences from the former members. And hopefully that is able to arm people with a little bit of resilience against it. Do you want to do the Linda Listen thing too?
Of course I want to do the Linda Listen. What's your Linda
All right,
Listen,
so
Mike?
I was thinking about this because I have a lot of things that I could complain about, like to the management and all that, and I think I do probably a good enough job of doing that on my channel. I would actually like to do the Linda Listen towards the people that are still there, because I've actually heard from some of my friends that have gotten out that they've had private conversations with other members that are still there that just think that they can't leave, like they are too old. So I would say, hey, listen, it's never too late. Like my mother was 76 years old when we got her out of there. Her life was virtually over. They took everything from her. She's now out. She's happy. She has a relationship with her grandchildren. She has life enrichment things that she does every day. She's found she's an amazing artist. She had no idea that, she was able to create poetry and art, and she does that all the time. And she lives her life the way she wants to now. And she did that when she is past the point of physically being able to do much for herself at all. So if you are at any point in your life, ask for help. It's never too late. You can 100% leave and take advantage of what time you have left, because that is our most precious commodity. Our time is the one thing we can never get more of. We can get more money. We can never get more time. So don't waste any more time. Just leave. And we're here for you.
I love it. Linda, listen, it's not too late. You can do it. So great. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing. I've loved all of your wisdom, all of your thoughts. It's been a really great conversation and very enlightening. So do you have any other final thoughts before we go?
No, thank you very much. It was an absolute pleasure to talk today. I appreciate you squeezing me in.
Of course. And guys, if you want to hear more of Mike's story and Rosemary's story, his mother, you can go to his YouTube channel at Mike Brown 101. We'll link it in the description. And if you want to support the podcast, just leaving those comments for our guests means so much to us, and it does help boost the algorithm. The longer you watch, the more YouTube promotes the video, so that's helpful too. You can go to our website at cultstoconsciousness.com under the merch tab, find some of those fun t-shirts. I need to do some Scientology specific shirts. If you have any ideas, let me know. And what else? If you want to come to Costa Rica with us, we're going to do some really fun stuff over there. There's 5 spots left as of right now. And if you want to join Patreon, patreon.com/cultstoconsciousness, you can do that too. I will link 2 videos down here below if you like this one that you can watch next. And until next time, follow your highest excitement, be conscious, and be well.